Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are here today starting the conversation on detention and return of the 5th round of conversations in this series that we have named the People's Migration Challenge. I'm Elena Olea, Associate Director for Programs from Alianza Americas, and I'm very honored to be here today moderating this conversation. As many of you know, we started a few months ago, actually, from the beginning of the year, convening these spaces in hopes of building a movement from the ground, in hopes of starting to discuss what our hopes and our expectations are in terms of migration policy. Many of us are migrants ourselves and understand firsthand the challenges, the struggles, and the triumphs of building a life's project in another country. And we specifically decided to tackle some topics that we believe are central to the life and the well-being of migrants. So with that in mind, we thought that it was important that one of the key topics that we wanted to discuss was detention and return. And the reason why we thought that this was an important conversation was perhaps or very straightforward, because we felt a great level of frustration in terms of where international standards are. Case in point, the Global Compact on Migration. We felt that we really needed to push forward the conversation because we believe that individuals should not be detained for immigration reasons. And we believe that there are many other humane and dignified ways to treat individuals as a whole, rather than incarcerating them. The privation of liberty should really be a measure of last resort, and it has become, in most parts of the world, part of the immigration process. And it was because of those concerns that we thought that it was extremely important to include detention and return. We're also very much concerned with returns, expulsions, deportations. They have different names in different countries, but we're very much concerned also in terms of how those administrative decisions are made with great impact for the life of migrants and their families. And so it was also with that topic in mind that we thought that it was extremely important to have this conversation today. And I'm really glad to be able to have this conversation with two extraordinary guests, two individuals that are working on this field, that have also different experiences and visions that they bring to the table. The first is Ambassador José Luis Pardo. He is a Spanish career diplomat, and he has served abroad in a number of missions in the embassies of Spain, in Libya and Jordan. And he was also counselor for EU affairs in Germany. He was also appointed ambassador of the Kingdom of Spain to the Republic of Niger. And in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, EU and Cooperation, he was also chief counselor for Euro-Mediterranean issues. He's also Deputy Director General for EU Foreign Action and Trade Affairs. And since 2017, he is Ambassador for Migratory Affairs. Ambassador Pardo, thank you for being here today. We really we're looking forward for the opportunity to bringing to the table a EU perspective, and we're hoping that you help us with that. And our second guest for the conversation today is Laila Razavi. Laila Razavi is the co-interim executive director at Freedom for Immigrants. If you have been working on issues related to detention of immigrants in the United States, I would argue that you have had to come across Freedom for Immigrants. Freedom for Immigrants is an organization that, by the way, allow me, Laila, to start by making the commercial, has a terrific website with lots of resources. If you're working on detention, I really recommend that you look at that website. And she has Her work for over 15 years has dealt on issues related to public policy and immigrant rights. Laila served as policy director at the California Immigrant Policy Center, where she was part of the legal team that drafted and passed and monitored also the implementation of California's sanctuary law, which I think is a privilege, being able to be part of the process to draft legislation, to then see it pass through Congress or the legislative body, and then work in its, monitor its implementation. It's indeed extremely interesting. Laila also worked as a national advocacy and policy counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a very important organization working on litigation for civil rights in the United States. And Laila has a very extensive career. She's a member of the National Lawyers Guild and the Iranian American Bar Alliance. So I really welcome this panel where we're going to have a European perspective and an American perspective into this discussion. And of course, this is, as it has been in the past, a conversation where we welcome the questions from the floor and some interventions as times permits. So I would like to welcome everyone to the conversation today and to ask you to start posting questions on the chat if you have them, so that we can bring to the table, or to raise your hand, and then we, as time permits, we will share the floor with some of you. Thank you for joining us here today. It's terrific to see that we have 150 persons joining us today for this important conversation. And I would like to start with you, Ambassador Pardo. I would like to give you the floor and to hear what is your perspective in terms of detention and return. What is happening in Europe? What perspectives do we have? What are kind of the highlights and, you know, the positive aspects that we can look forward to, or perhaps lessons that we can learn and avoid in other parts of the world?
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you very much for the kind invitation that gives me the opportunity to share views with you or with all the people who are following us in the net. So thank you very much. I will not be I will be short and brief, because I want, rather than speaking, hearing from you. Well, when we build this link, as far as a matter of fact, we deal with all of immigration-related issues, and especially this link between detention and returns and so on. There's always the two extreme approaches to things, to migratory-related things. The exclusive humanitarian approach, only taking into account human rights, and on the opposite, the exclusive migration management approach, that giving only importance to rules. One approach gives exclusive importance to rights. The other extreme gives only importance to rules. So thank God, I mean, with time and maturity of our debate on migratory issues, it is very seldom to see these positions in a pure state. So that is combinations. From the one side, it has been a kind of evolution to see, well, to exclude detention to minors, for instance, or to give or propose alternatives to detention. And on the other side, there has been some kind of advancing to a step forward in linking detention exclusively to expulsion and returns, forced returns issues. So I think that in the middle is the right position, and we have all of us giving steps forward. The extreme positions, detention, in no circumstances, no way, and on the other side, the sacrality of the borders. I mean, and each trespassing, irregular trespassing of a border must be considered as a crime, and so to deal accordingly a migrant, a regular migrant, as a criminal. I mean, so in these streams that, thank God, are is not forgotten. We must we must put pressure that on a reasonable approach to this link. Well, in the past were very much on the table, and that have not been forgotten. Sorry, so far. So as far as the European perspective is concerned, you know that we are in a position of dealing with the new European Pact on Migration and Asylum, that we have made a lot of advancements in the question of external intervention, in the question of legal migration, on some technical issues as far as fighting irregular migration and internal dimension of control of borders and so on and so on. And but still, there are differences, strong differences within member states in several issues. Mainly, I will not bore you with the debate that you all know about solidarity and responsibility of countries that are first entry as being the external borders of the European Union, and other countries that are not. But there are too many differences, I would say, as far as the first reception of irregular migrants are concerned. And in that, a point on detention. And so I cannot explain very with detail the differences, because it englobes all the 27 member states. I will speak by myself, by my country, by Spain, and we have difficulties in that. We have a lot of difficulties, for instance, and some proposals about, for instance, the closed centers of detention. For us is a difficulty, it's a strong difficulty, because our internal legislation forbids this kind of centers. We will explain afterwards what kind of centers we do have. But as permanent and long stay closed centers, we have there a difficulty. And we have other difficulties, for instance, how it is not solved. It's only a proposal, so I cannot go further. But this proposal of make the juridical abstraction that people has not entered the European Union territory when they have done it, is for us, Spain, I again speak only on behalf of my country, for us these two are a big difficulty. And in this concern, we should take the lessons learned in other regions, in other countries, in other situations, but we should take that into account. So unfortunately, I cannot go further because the debate is internal debate, but you know which are the positions. It is true. It is not a sin. I would say it is not a sin to consider national borders as if not sacred, important for us too. For us too, borders are important for everyone who deserves the name of being a state. If you are not able to control your borders, you don't deserve to call yourself a state. You will be a fragile state, or you will be a failed state. But if you cannot control in a reasonable way, your borders, being the borders, one of the elements of an state, and that differentiates one state to the other, to the neighbor one. So it is important, of course, border control, of course, integrated border control in a reasonable way. So that means that Spain does not made in some specific point attentions. No, we do, and I will explain in which sense and with direction that we think that is in general our migratory policy is based in four very clear principles. Only four very clear: fighting smuggling of migrants, not the migrant. The migrant is not is a criminal, is the majority of the times the victim, but fighting the networks of smuggling, that is the first source of violation of human rights. The second is promotion of legal migration, because we do need migration. And so promoting legal, extra-legal ways of irregular migration. The third pillar is fighting root causes of non-voluntary migration, but fighting them in an efficient way by in origin and transit countries, and with an aim of preventing that, of being advanced in our ways to face that in a global approach to migration. And fourth, last but not least, respect of human rights, and what goes beyond respect of human dignity. So this is the four pillars. So very clear. So we apply two. We tend to apply two in thorny issues, and this one, is this one of detention and expulsions, deportations, and migration in general. First, in Spain, the illegal trespassing of our border is not a crime. It's an administrative offense. It's not a crime. So we don't criminalize the irregular migrants. Well, we don't put them immediately to jail or these kind of things. It's not a crime in Spain, the irregular trespassing of a border. We have three kinds of centers. We have the Centro de Estancia Temporal, that is temporary stay attention center, that is for mainly the migrants who came by safe and rescue operations. It's just 72 hours with authority policy in order to ascertain which are the vulnerabilities of the people who came before addressing them to one way or the other. This is the way of international protection, or is the way of economic protection, or whatever, or if it's minors, whatever, these kind of things. And two important, I said these four principles, in order to take some information about crimes committed to the migrants, crimes committed by smuggling networks, because sometimes there are crimes. Sometimes we receive boats with, unfortunately, and this is a shame for everybody, dead bodies on it. So we need to know who has provoked these deaths. And so in this period of time, we take some information to combat smuggling. The second kind of centers is the Centros de Estancia Temporal Inmigrantes, the temporary stay migrants that we have only in Ceuta y Melilla. Ceuta and Melilla are the Spanish cities that are in African territory. It's the only extended border of Europe in Africa. And so it is special. It's centers, they are open centers, for a range of things in order for these migrants, if the case is possible and is legal, to transfer to mainland. And finally, and this is the third sentence that connects us more with the theme that we are discussing, is the Centro de Internamiento de Extranjeros, Center for Detention of Foreigners. And it is true that it is a center that is devoted to expulsions, and in these cases, foreigners are centered there for a maximum period of 60 days in order to assure that the other expulsion is made. But on that, I must say that only applies to persons who, more than irregular entry to Spain, irregularly stay in Spain. The result perhaps is more or less the same, but it's a difference, a juridical, a legal difference. So irregular stay in Spain. And the goal of this detention, the exclusive goal of this detention, is to assure expulsions, is to assure that another of forced return is applied. So that's why, if being this the only object or only aim of this detention, of course, it is not applied to minors, because minors cannot be forcefully returned to their own country, so it's not applied to minors. And it is not applied when there is no possibility of this return. For instance, in COVID time, we closed all the things because there were no possibility to return. So we closed all the centers and we were no longer active because there were no possibility under COVID times to return. On top of that, these centers and all this legislation is legally it's not only legally controlled. Of course, there is the legislation, of course, the law of the rights of foreigners, the regulation of these kind of centers, totally transparency. You enter the webpage of the Ministry of Interior; it is explained perfectly with detail all these things. But it is not only monitored, but ordered by the judiciary. It is the judge who decides. It is the judge to decide. The Ministry of Interior propose, in some special cases, the internment in centers of expulsion. Because normally, as I said before, staying in Spain without legal permit, or even working in Spain without working permits, there are two administrative offenses. And these offenses can be, administratively speaking, faced by two different experiences. First, a fine. 90% of the cases, the majority of the cases are through fine, a fine, and that's all. And or through expulsion order. If the situation advises the expulsion order, because some very legal specified cases, in cases of extreme, in cases of danger for national security or whatever, in case of this foreigner has committed crimes or special administrative offenses, these specific cases, the Ministry of Interior can propose to an order of expulsion to be delivered. And that proposal goes to the judge. And the judge is the one who decides if, as a cautelar provisional measure, the judge is the one who decides if this person is advisable to enter in a CIE, that is in a center that is detention, in a center of expulsion of migrants. That these centers are closed. It is true, but with a maximum of 60 days. So it's the judge who decides, taking into account on the case, for instance. And it's only a minority of cases, a big minority of cases in which the judge assumes this measure. Mainly in cases, for instance, where it is not clear the documentation or the address of the person to be expelled, and so there are possibilities of making in the European, for instance, secondary movements to other European Union member countries, and so on. But for instance, the judge does not give this accord to internment. For instance, when the country of origin of the person concerned, we have not extradition treaties with them. So because I come back to the first, detention is only linked to forcefully return. So if the country has not treaty or has not a mechanism or has not arrangements with different country, the judge refuses every time the proposal of entering in the center of detention. The same applies even if we have treaties, we know that they are not used or they are not applied on practical terms. So as a matter of fact, at the end of the day, there are a very limited number of persons who go to the center of detention. In these centers, of course, there are two in the webpage all the assurances as far as the respect of human rights are concerned, as far as of course free interpretation, free legal protection, free access to NGOs, free access to refugees, High Commission of Refugee Agency in Spain, to IOM. I mean, of course, free access, because in Spain is for all universal access to health system, regardless of the juridical status of the migrant. So, of course, that's without saying that is the case too in the people who are in these centers. So there is a full range. I cannot comment on them, but if you are interested, is in the web page of the Ministry of Interior. So transparency in the as far as the rights of the persons who are in these centers. Of course, we have a guaranteed mechanism and system in Spain. They can make appeals of the first of the order of expulsion, and afterwards, at any time they can apply for international protection. For instance, we have even cases in which they applied when they were climbing the stairs of the plane sometimes. So we are very guaranteed in this sense, because, as I said before, human rights recognition and human dignity is one of the values of our migratory policy. Is our migratory policy perfect? No, as no one is, but we are I would say proud. I will see on our policy. We made our utmost to make impulse to these goals, and even in this thorny issue of detention. I said, and I close with that, I said that minors are never one goes to these centers. Well, there's an exception when there is family and their parents ask for the minors to be with them, and in these cases only when there is separate spaces and assurance of the mental health too of the minors. So it's more or less. So sorry for being so long, because I promised to be short, and I'm afraid I've been a bit long. But well, this is a thorny issue. We must recognize all of us. We must keep on, all of us, to advance in the domain of looking for alternatives to the detention. And I think we are in mind. We have in mind, all of us, that migration must be managed too, and so it must be managed. Not any management of migration is acceptable. Only the one who respects human rights and human dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Pardo. I am going to take the liberty to ask you 2 short follow-up questions to make sure I understood everything correctly. Is there free legal representation to any migrant, or only to those who are detained for that 60-day period?
Yes, in the resettlement, resettlement for the when they come to Spain, yes, in these 62 days, 72 hours, they have access to legal representation, to legal advice. Mainly, they have the right to our NGOs have the right to contact, if they want, I mean, the person concerned, the migrant concerned, and they have to, yes, they have a free legal advocacy. If they have not advocate, of course, if they have not lawyer, of course, it is free of charge, and translation is too free of charge.
And in that 60-day detention, when they are going to be deported or expelled from Spain, do they have free legal representation there as well?
Yes, yes. And on top of that, not only you can see on the networks, not only from the ministry, but for a lot of NGOs who just advise to migrants to do that. And well, it's a good information that they get delivered to them, and it's like that. It is true that perhaps in some cases, particular cases could have problems with that, but in the law it's clearly established that they have right to free legal representation and advice.
And you mentioned there's a maximum 60-day period. If the person the legal process has not succeeded after 60 days, they automatically are released?
Automatically, and they cannot be taken twice to a center of detention.
Okay, I like that.
Be again. No, it's not. It's not. And the same, of course, apply. It's not compatible with fine. So you must decide at the beginning if it's fine or initiating a proceeding of expulsion. If it is fine, okay, but you cannot this procedure and fine at the same time. And after the 60 days, you are free. I mean, free. You have always been free, but you are out of the center, and you cannot be reintroduced to the center again.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you have given us a lot to think about, and I really appreciate, and I think it's an important way to move forward the discussion to differentiate those two moments. What happens when individuals are apprehended as they are attempting to enter the country, you know, or the first time that they are found inside the country, and then a different procedure when they are going to be expelled. I think that this is indeed a very useful distinction. Laila, I would like to give you the floor now.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction, Helena. I appreciate it. And hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you today. I have to apologize in advance because this is much earlier than I'm typically awake. It's about 5:30 in the morning over here. So I will try to be coherent and hopefully form complete sentences. It's always sobering to hear people in other countries talk about their systems and processes because it helps me appreciate how far we really have to go in the United States. Unfortunately, I think the picture here is much more grim when it comes to the question of detention. So in the United States, we typically have over 500,000 people per year incarcerated in the United States. And this takes place in a variety of different systems. We have a sprawling industry all across the country. So there are people who are apprehended at the border by our Border Patrol agents and put into specific holding facilities, often for short periods of time. There are people who are put into jails and prisons all around the interior of the country. Those are by our immigration and customs official. And then we also have federal prisons as well, run by the US Marshals, that are typically reserved for people who have been convicted of specific federal offenses and also do not have lawful status. So there's really an entire government schema and apparatus that's been set up around this. And it's buttressed in the United States by a very aggressive private industry. So we have multinational, transnational, global corporations that are oftentimes based in the United States and have made quite a profit at providing services for the government in detaining and jailing people. And so there are a mix. There are some local jails that are often run by a local sheriff. And so these are jails where there will be Americans housed for small crimes and petty offenses, and they will rent a portion of that jail to the federal government to house immigrants. And then in addition to that, there are these large, sprawling prisons that can house thousands and thousands of people, and those are typically run by private government contractors. And every single portion of this will get outsourced, from the construction and management of the facility to the guards that are in the facility, interfacing with the immigrants, to the uniforms that they're forced to wear, the food that they're served in their mess hall. The transportation itself is quite a profitable industry. So there are specific companies, global corporations that contract with the United States government just to transport people between detention centers. And we've done quite a bit of work documenting something called circular transfers, in which an individual will get transferred over a period of several months from one facility to another, and then back to the original facility they were in. And so it looks quite senseless. Oftentimes this will come in response or directly after an individual speaks up to protest their conditions that they're facing in the specific detention center. And in particular, we saw the use of circular transfers at the height of the COVID pandemic last year, when numbers were soaring to astronomical degrees within the detention prisons specifically. So very dangerous practices. And that in and of itself creates a profit, because there are contractors that are involved in every step of these processes. So in the United States, when we talk about how to deal with the problem of detention, we're dealing with a very multi-headed beast. I mean, this is like an octopus that has tentacles in every aspect of it. So we really have quite a large industry and government system that we have to contend with here. One last thing I'll say about this is that all of these contracts typically have what's called a bed quota. So it'll be written into the contract. You as the contractor are guaranteed a certain margin of profit in the form of a quota. So you're promised that you'll be given X number of beds on every given day that you're operating the facility, which guarantees you a minimum margin of profit. And what that does is essentially create an incentive in which the immigration officials have these empty beds that they do in fact have to fill. So it creates an incentive to go out into the community and police people and look for people without lawful status. So we're really not talking about an organized system. It's a system that's very much focused on policing and punitive mechanisms of going after people, targeting them, finding them. In the United States, crossing the border without proper documentation is not a crime. It is an administrative offense. I think one thing that's different than the example, than the European example, is that it has in fact been criminalized despite being an administrative offense. And this has happened in a few different ways. First, I will say we have some federal laws on the books that are being used increasingly to get people into detention for lengthy periods of time. So there are certain ways that federal prosecutors can charge people with a crime for re-entry into the country if it's not their first time attempting to enter. And here in California, we share a border with Mexico. We have many people who are migrants coming not just from Mexico, but principally these days from Central America to reunite with family members. So you have these many cases in which family came here in the 80s or 90s, and other people are now coming to be reunited with their loved ones. And so I have met people who say, I will keep coming. And so the government's response to that has been to charge them with a federal crime. In addition to that, anytime an individual is brought into contact with the United States criminal justice system, whether it's for a low-level petty offense or a more serious or violent crime, they are immediately after serving their prison sentence then brought into criminal custody. And this typically happens even if the person has been proven innocent of that crime or been released on bond, they're going to then be moved into immigration detention. So that's another way that the federal government comes into contact with people. And then lastly, there's of course the instance of people who are going about their daily life. They're going home or to get groceries or on their way to work or picking their kids up from school, or they're at the wrong place at the wrong time and they get picked up as well. And so I do think within immigrant communities, there has been a long history now of fear. And particularly this reached heights during the Trump administration, given the extreme rhetoric that was being used by the government. But there has been a pervasive fear for a very long time in immigrant communities because of some of the mechanisms through which people are brought into this system. So what are the conditions like in a detention center? Well, at Freedom for Immigrants, one of our principal aims is to document the abuses that happen inside of immigration detention centers. So if you go to our website and look at our monitoring page, we have a whole host of civil rights complaints. We file these on an ongoing basis. I mean, the number of civil rights complaints that we have filed for both individuals and for entire classes of people who've been impacted in a specific facility is really astounding. We put these out on a weekly or monthly basis, and these are civil rights complaints that are presented to a federal agency within the government. And it's their charge to take those complaints and investigate them. Typically, there's been very minimal oversight that's been provided by the government. And it's quite interesting to hear in the EU example, the role that judges have played. Our courts have been much more hesitant to try to rein in the use and practices of detention. And so we do have this documentation and paper trail of very extreme instances, things like torture or sexual assault that occur within these facilities, and oftentimes retaliation, again, for people who speak out against conditions, whether it's being denied access to visiting with their family, or if they're asking for better meals, they will experience retaliation very frequently. And so one of the main things we do is try to provide support to the people inside and their families to assist them in speaking out and trying to assert their rights. I do have to say, in the United States, by and large, people in detention do not have any guaranteed access to legal representation. However, we have seen that an individual who has access to an attorney is at least 5 times more likely to succeed in their immigration case. And so we have a system in which people every day are being sent back to their country of origin and deprived of the ability to stay in the United States, again, oftentimes where they have family members or strong community ties that they've established, and they are sent back perhaps to a country where they may face persecution, and they had access to a legal pathway to staying in the country. And it's simply the fact that they were unable to get legal representation, that they were unable to adjust their immigration status. And one of the things that's interesting to note here too is when it comes to the immigration court system, we've had a massive backlog, and people's cases may pend for years and years. We have no similar rule to the EU in which you're let go after 2 months. There are oftentimes people who are in detention for a short stay of a few months and they cycle in and out. But we do have cases of people who stay within the prison for 2 years or for extended periods of time. And so this is a very serious deprivation of an individual's liberty rights with very little guarantees around due process or legal protections. In the United States in particular, I think it's important to mention a couple of things that are happening. We presently have a policy that was enacted by President Trump and has been largely upheld by the Biden administration, which is called MPP. It's often been referred to as the Remain in Mexico program. And this program shut the doors to the United States effectively at the southern border at the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. And what this has resulted in is all along the southern border within Mexico, or the northern border in Mexico. So in communities like Juarez or like Tijuana, you have tent communities that have popped up, entire shanty towns that are there now with people living in tents who have migrated from all over the world. This is not exclusively Central Americans. You have Haitians and West Africans and people from various different countries who have come and are living within tents, waiting essentially for their turn to try to get into the United States. And so this is a very serious denial of the United States' obligation as a government to provide asylum, or at least an opportunity for an individual to make their claim for asylum when reaching US soil. It's supremely unprecedented, and I think all of us are in complete shock that this is still going on 10 months into the Biden administration in particular. In addition to that, the United States, for many years now, going back to as early as the Obama administration, in an attempt to try to convey that the numbers of migrants are going down at the southern border, has pursued externalization policies. So that has looked like giving massive amounts of financial aid to Mexico in particular. Also, there have been forms of financial aid provided to the governments in the Northern Triangle. But there have been these bilateral agreements between the United States and Mexico to essentially get Mexico to pursue very similar forms of immigration detention within their own country. And so the result has been that whereas for many years there's been a history of migrants coming up from the southern border of Mexico along the western corridor of the country to reach the northern border of Mexico and present themselves at the United States front door, they're now forced, because of the aggressive policing that's been set up along the western route in Mexico, people are going deeper into the interior of the country, where they're coming into contact with people who may prey upon them, given their vulnerabilities, and they're facing much more violence and insecurity. And the route has become much more treacherous. And now they're much more likely to get picked up and thrown into detention in Mexico. So we saw within these bilateral agreements, it was not just monetary support, but there were actually immigrations and border officials flying down to Mexico to provide trainings. And they even paired Americans with Mexicans to be like buddies or mentors to teach them how to pursue the same policies the American government has pursued. And one of the things that's really despicable about this is that many administrations, again, this is an issue that reaches across the various political parties, but many administrations have touted that numbers are lower at the southern border. And I think it's a very big problem that we have to shift the mentality of the government and the general public, that migration is not looked at as just how many people are coming to our doors, but how many people are we providing real solutions and pathways to getting to a safe place for them to live. So I know I've gone well over our allotted time. I'll wrap up by just saying a couple of things here. In the United States, in civil society, many of us have been talking for many years now about looking for alternatives to detention. In the United States, again, because I think our prison companies have been so adaptable and quick to profit on various changes in the market, they have seen the push for alternatives to detention and been very quick to capitalize on that. So many of the private prison companies have now started subsidiaries or different arms of their companies that essentially present themselves as nonprofits and contract with the federal government to run what they call alternatives to detention, in which people are placed on ankle monitors and placed on house arrest and forced to submit themselves to various forms of government surveillance. And that is currently what the Biden administration has been pursuing as an alternative to detention. What we're really advocating for at Freedom for Immigrants is a complete shift away from the detention system and away from a punitive system to one that really focuses on the rights of migrants and refugees. In the United States, we do have a small but successful refugees resettlement program. And given the large number of people and global instability, I think more and more it's imperative that we shift to finding ways to provide more supportive services that resemble the refugee resettlement model and help welcome and receive immigrants and introduce them, integrating them into the fabric of society rather than pursuing these punitive models. And so we've been advocating with the government for some time now to, as they're exploring more and more of these alternatives to detention, to move them away from the federal agencies that are charged with policing and securing the borders and into the arms of the federal government that deal with refugees and with social services. So it's very a radically different approach from what's presently being explored in the United States. And so I say that because I think in our circles, alternatives to detention has long been a very popular thing. And unfortunately, that phrase has been used more and more by the private prison companies to say, if you want an alternative, we've got one. And we've seen that it's been very lacking. And I can share here in the chat a resource or perhaps share it with our moderators to send out afterward. We recently put out a report in conjunction with Cardozo Law School about the abuses that happen when people are placed on ankle monitors. We were able to document and survey people who've been on the monitors. It's quite shocking. People experience electric shocks, people who have their skin getting cut into. And so, you know, the idea that people being put on this shackle around their ankle is somehow a much more humane way to integrate immigrants into society, I think is a far cry from reality. So I know that I've gone over time, so I'll stop there so we have some room for questions and discussion.
Laila, thank you for your comprehensive presentation. I know you've taken you both took more time, but I think that you both made a great effort to try to describe a complex system. So thank you. Thank you for that. I think that the contrast between what Ambassador Pardo was presenting in Spain and what you were presenting, Laila, in terms of the situation in the United States is quite appalling. And there have been a number of comments on the chat for those of you that have not been able to follow that. I truly recommend, because I think that there are a number of important points that have been made that I want to bring back to the conversation. One is the issue of the privatization of the system. And Susan Sash made a very good comment here in terms of how American capitalism creates conditions that incentivize the violation of human rights. And I think this also ties back to your last comment about alternatives to detention, how these alternatives are not really alternatives to detention. But are really other, forms of human rights violations that are being perpetrated with under the disguise that these are more humane ways of controlling the movement of individuals. But I think that that's really a very important point. Cecily also made a comment on the chat that I would like to ask both of you your reactions to it. I'm going to present a few elements, so perhaps both of you can react, which I think it's important. And she was mentioning how besides, the for-profit contractors around prisons, there are also not-for-profit organizations that are involved on the issue of detention, that many organizations are kind of survived providing services to individuals who are detained. And I think, and I want to ask you both whether you can describe that a little bit better, because Ambassador Pardo mentioned that in the case of Spain, civil society organizations or NGOs are able, to offer their services to individuals in detention who can seek or not their service. So I think, Laila, it would be important if you can give us a little bit more information about what's happening in the US. I saw a statistic, and if I'm not mistaken, I understand that in the US, only 60% of individuals in immigration proceedings have legal representation. And this, of course, includes those who are detained and those who are not. But if you have any other numbers or any other perspective on this issue, I think that would be something important also to consider in this in the discussion as we're moving forward. I also wanted to ask you, Laila, if you can describe a little bit whether there is a maximum time of detention for an individual in the US who cannot be deported back to his country of origin. What's the in the Spain we have a 60-day limit. What is the limit in the United States? I think that this is important. And I also want to underscore the Spain element of you cannot be detained twice, you can be fined or detained. If you can describe a little bit better how the system works in the US. And I can see that Cecily would like to clarify her point. So if we can give Cecily the floor for a moment and then give it back to Ambassador Pardo and Laila, I think that would be wonderful. Cecily, please go ahead. Can you unmute Cecily, please?
Yes, and thank you. I was really kind of trying to draw the sort of the problem where we have very dedicated and historic NGOs that work in support of advocacy for immigrants, but are also sort of tuned into these alternatives to detention. The example I'm thinking of is I do not speak for USCRI, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, but I'm a former employee, and I was not involved with this program, but at the time that I was there, we were funded to open up Rincón del Sol, which is a alternative to detention for unaccompanied minors in Florida. And so it wasn't necessarily that that's a violation or that they're doing anything inherently inhumane, but that it's yet another element that adds to the complexity of the immigration system. And ultimately, for practical purposes in a nonprofit, you need grant money to survive and do the other things that you do as well. So I know that was a complex decision for USCRI at the time.
Thank you, Cecily. Ambassador Pardo.
Elena, I have been told that you had interpretation in Spanish.
Sí, yes, we do. We have interpretation into a number of languages. I apologize for that. I should have said that. We have interpretation to French, to Spanish, and to Arabic. And my mother tongue is Spanish, and I thought for a minute, should I speak in Spanish? But then I started in English and off we go. But if you want to switch to Spanish, please everyone be mindful that there's the globe in the bottom, and you can, if someone wants to speak in another language, there's interpretation available.
Elena, aprovecharé esta ocasión para mezclar español e inglés. Intentaré hablar lento para los traductores que tengan, lo cual para los españoles es difícil porque hablamos muy rápido. El español, ¿no? A diferencia del otro lado del charco, que habláis un poco más lento, ¿no? En primer lugar, quería hacer una clarificación sobre la fine, la multa. Vamos a suponer que una persona es encontrada en la calle, ¿no? Está en estancia irregular, ¿no? Y se le pide documentación, ¿no? Entonces entra dentro de la falta administrativa de estar residiendo en España de forma irregular. Y ahí se deciden las dos cosas dependiendo de la situación, etc. Si tiene multa, ¿no? Perfecto, ¿no? Pero la próxima vez que pueda toparse en la misma situación, probablemente pueda planteársele otra vez una multa o pueda plantearse, ¿no?, el expediente de expulsión, ¿no? Por eso los abogados de oficio siempre aconsejan a pagar la multa de forma inmediata para evitar posibles, ¿no?, en el futuro, bueno, pues se ocurre esta circunstancia, pues que a la persona pueda probar una cierta buena fe, ¿verdad?, en su estancia irregular. Nadie puede, desde luego no es la vocación de España, expulsar a todos los migrantes irregulares que tenemos en el país. Evidentemente no. No solemos hacer redadas o este tipo de cosas, ¿no?, que ocurren en nuestros países. No. Por eso, cuando se toma esta decisión judicial, que vuelvo a repetir, no es que monitoree el juez el proceso, sino que lo lidera. Es él el que decide esto siempre, ¿no? Y solo en muy contados casos, vuelvo a repetir, cuando hay una posibilidad de retorno no voluntario, admite esta medida. Que esto sí, vuelvo a repetir, solo puede ser una vez. Si en los 60 días no se ha retornado, pues la persona no puede ser sometida a una multa, sí, en el futuro, sí, pero no otra vez a este expediente, ¿no?, de retención. En segundo lugar, alternativas. Como es tan específico los casos y es cierto también las lecciones aprendidas, ¿no?, de algunos internamientos en centros que se ha demostrado y lo hemos aprendido, sobre todo en el COVID, que nos ha permitido a todos, ¿verdad?, ¿no?, eso, un tiempo de reflexión, ¿no?, adicional a las vulnerabilidades, a todas las lagunas de gestión migratoria que teníamos todos, ¿no? Bueno, pues hemos aprendido que no merecía la pena, y tampoco, en lo más importante, en el ámbito de derechos humanos, ¿no?, pedir ingresos en los centros de retención cuando no se iba a producir el retorno, ¿no?, por las causas que, ¿no? Y entonces se ha concentrado esas medidas en pocas nacionalidades, ¿no?, que sí que se realizan estos retornos no voluntarios. Quiero decir, aprovecho la ocasión también, ¿no?, que probablemente no respecto a nosotros, pero respecto a otros estados con posiciones más duras, ¿no?, en términos de detención, ¿no?, quizá una mayor colaboración de los países de origen en los términos de retornos, ¿no? Quizá facilitaría un poco, ¿no? Disminuir un poco la rigidez, ¿no? que algunos estados tienen en cuanto a la relación detención-migración, ¿no? Ya no detención, deportación, sino detención-migración, ¿no? que es una relación mucho más preocupante y inadmisible desde nuestro punto de vista, ¿no? En el futuro. Y por último, la pregunta que has hecho, Elena, de las ONGs, etcétera, ¿no? En España tenemos en cuanto a los temas migratorios, una sociedad civil extremadamente activa, que sigue al minuto, ¿no? todas las cuestiones migratorias. Tenemos un foro tripartito, se llama el Foro de Integración Social de los Migrantes, donde se habla de muchísimas más cosas que no solo la integración, y es continuo el monitoreo, es su obligación, ¿no? de la sociedad civil organizada en España sobre estos temas. Y por tanto, también son públicas las carencias que tenemos, ¿no? y las denuncias puntuales que en casos puntuales esto pueden darse, ¿no? Como nosotros además no creemos, ¿no? que además de que no lo aplicamos por razones legales y por razones morales y porque creemos en ello, es que tampoco creemos que la detención sea un elemento disuasorio o un elemento que evite migración irregular. Sinceramente no lo creemos. O por lo menos en España, con las condiciones de las cárceles en España. Sinceramente no lo creemos que sea un elemento disuasorio, ¿no? O centros de detención masivos, digamos, o demasiado visibles, no, estos temas además en nuestra sociedad se llevan de una manera muy, como diré, low profile desde el punto de vista de la imagen, ¿no? Sabemos que es complicado, ¿no? Esto para todos, es complicado para nosotros, es complicado para los estados de origen, el recibir a sus nacionales que han estado de forma irregular residiendo en otro país. Es difícil para todos si no queremos poner dificultades a nadie. Y no hay imágenes, no hay, no sé cómo decir, no hacemos publicidad porque somos conscientes de la accesibilidad de todos y de los migrantes en particular, ¿no? Que bien, bueno, pues desgraciadamente pues truncada, ¿no? su aventura migratoria en busca de algo mejor, ¿no? Y entonces en esta situación el acceso de las ONGs a los centros y de atención a las personas que están en centros no es excesivamente necesaria en nuestro caso, ¿no? porque hay una serie de seguridades. Por cierto, he intentado, pero soy bastante torpe en el chat, he intentado trasladar, porque había alguna pregunta, la página web, ¿no? donde se puede encontrar toda la información del sistema español, que simplemente si cliquean en Google Centros de Internamiento de Extranjeros, inmediatamente le viene la conexión a la página web del Ministerio del Interior. Y ahí vienen absolutamente todos estos elementos, también las condiciones para la orden de expulsión, en fin, ahí está explicado perfectamente todo. Siento no poder mandarlo porque, no sé, soy un poco torpe. Y por último, las alternativas a la detención. En nuestro caso, como la detención es muy limitada para los casos muy concretos que he señalado, no hay alternativas porque la detención es un medio para un fin exclusivamente, que es el retorno no voluntario en condiciones muy específicas, ¿no? La mayoría de los retornos, nosotros somos voluntarios y retornos forzosos, se hace en muchos casos sin necesidad de detención, digamos, ¿no? Entonces, las alternativas, no trabajamos mucho en alternativas porque es un porcentaje muy, muy pequeño, pero sí, sé que no es el tema, pero alternativas a la custodia de los menores no acompañados. Ahí sí tenemos centros públicos, los menores no acompañados, y directamente, inmediatamente se trasladan a los servicios de custodia en nuestro caso, las regiones. Y están en centros que son abiertos, evidentemente, pero bueno, pues estamos buscando alternativas, patrocinios privados, patrocinios comunitarios, ¿no? Para, bueno, hacer que los menores se encuentren hasta que lleguen a la mayoría de edad porque la custodia de la administración pública es obligatoria hasta que llegan a los 18 años, se encuentren en ámbitos pues, más acordes para un desarrollo un poco más seguro y mejor, ¿no? Por lo tanto, alternativas no vemos tanto en la detención, vuelvo a repetir, porque nuestro caso es limitado, ¿no? Pero sí en otros elementos, por ejemplo, como es el caso de los centros para menores, que son abiertos, evidentemente.
Gracias, embajador Pardo. Laila, you have the floor.
Thank you. And con permiso, voy a seguir en inglés. I don't think you guys want to hear my Spanish. So, yeah, it's again so sad when I hear these stories, because it just makes me appreciate how dire things really are in the United States. There is no legal limitation on the maximum time that an individual can stay in detention. And in those rare instances in which an individual is unable to be returned to their country of origin, we've seen some extreme situations in which people languish in detention for an extended period of time. And the United States attempts to put them into or deport them to some third country. They may call it a third safe country, but at times they'll negotiate with the other country to take the individual. And oftentimes it's done without a lot of foresight. And so the individual is now in this third country without any plan for their survival or any form of support. So things are quite a bit more dire here. There's absolutely no limitation on the number of times an individual can be put into detention. As I mentioned earlier, I have met those people who say, I'm going to, I've come 10 times and I'll keep coming. And each time they'll be apprehended and put into a detention center and then expelled. And oftentimes they're expelled just south of the border. If they're picked up on the border, they'll be picked up and released back into Mexico rather than being taken back to their country. And so there's this revolving door. And again, there's no incentive for the government to end that practice, because there is this large profit motive that's incentivizing this type of multiple apprehension. So we don't have any of those protections. I think, to go back to Cecily's question, it is interesting to consider the role of nonprofits in incarceration. I did not speak about minors. It complicates things a bit in the United States, but we do have minors when they're traveling alone. They're apprehended by the government, and they are in the custody of a different arm of the government that I think largely is considered to be more humane. It's separate from the apparatus that typically deals with incarceration. It's the Office of Refugee Resettlement that is in charge of those facilities. And they contract with nonprofit service providers, often charity-based, faith-based organizations or community groups that are running those centers. The conditions very much range, though, from around the country. Some operate like youth shelters, others operate more like juvenile hall facilities. So centers for troubled youth and people who've committed, who are teenagers or adolescents and have committed certain crimes and are placed into government custody. And so I think there have been a lot of questions raised about the ethics of nonprofit agencies and whether they're really providing a better or more humane service, given that the children are on the premises in custody of the government and unable to leave. We've seen some questions around the role of nonprofits arise even within the context of the Remain in Mexico policy. So briefly after President Biden took office, he attempted to scale back the Remain in Mexico policy and said that children, minors, would be allowed into the country for the first time since the COVID pandemic. And so this created a huge problem in which parents and relatives that were traveling with minor children were incentivized to separate at the border and to tell the minor traveling that with them, well, at least you go in because you'll be safe. Here we're sitting on the streets. We're like sitting ducks sitting in a tent. You should go into the United States. And so there was a huge outpouring of support and resources from community groups, nonprofit agencies, local governments that rushed to build shelters. And, I think people in the spirit of goodwill in the United States rush to donate blankets and toys and coloring books and go visit with the children. And people really wanted to receive these kids. But at the same time, they were in these large facilities, again, in the height of the COVID pandemic. Oftentimes they were huge convention centers, conference rooms, and children were just lined up in rows on cots. So it very much looked like an emergency shelter. And again, many of these kids had family or relatives that they were trying to reunite with in the United States. So I think there were a lot of questions there about why they were being put into the custody of the government rather than reunited with their families. So I think things get a bit tricky because there's a lot of ethical questions around the role of charity, welcoming, and it's a fine line between that versus forcing and imposing that type of quote unquote care on an individual. And so I think at Freedom for Immigrants, we've always operated under the assumption that the individual coming into the country or the family and guardians of a minor child know best what is necessary for their own resettlement. And so if they have family and a community that's ready to receive them, we generally see that there are greater rates of success with communities receiving and welcoming people from their own ethnic community and people who are their family contacts and loved ones, rather than us trying to create a punitive and mandatory, obligatory, compulsory program. So I think whatever alternative we pursue and whatever collaborations civil society and governments undertake, it's really important that we operate at least on that foundational level, that we're respecting the agency and autonomy of the migrant that's entering the country and following their direction about what they see as their greatest needs, and that nothing is compulsory, that these are not coercive or punitive systems where we're trying to surveil and track people, but really systems of care and support that help welcome and receive the migrant.
Thank you, Laila. I'm mindful of the time, and I would like to give the chance to two persons who would like to speak from the floor. So I would like to ask Negosi Luis Usoma to start, and then we can continue with Farah Al Abdallah. Negosi, the floor is yours. Please be very brief too. I would ask both of you. Thank you. You're muted, Negosi. Can you please unmute Negosi?
Okay, okay, it's unmuted. Yeah, they've already addressed my concerns, but let me make this short one. Ambassador Jose, what of those who violate, anyone that violates Dublin III regulations and brought back to Spain, probably from Germany or from Belgium and brought back to Spain? Is the person put back in the prison? Because you earlier mentioned that once someone has left detention, the person will not be put in detention again. So if the person leaves the detention and leaves Spain, probably go to and violates the Dublin III and brought back, would they spend time again in detention? And Laila, it's very simple. Did you say that those in detention, immigrants that are in deportation camps, are meant to wear uniforms? Thank you. Probably in some parts of the US. Thank you.
Thank you, Negosi. Farah?
Hello, and thank you so much. At the Quest Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, we've had this discussion regarding detention and return. And we have some points to make, and that is in regards to how can governments and civil society work together in that regard. So some points we've covered, and here we're covering opinions from the MENA region and from the Gulf region. So civil society organization can be the middleman in the process, being a service provider and supporter to migrants while communicating and holding constant links with the government. Because advocacy efforts by civil society are essential in this, while filling the gap in services and support provided to migrants, allowing in a way or making the work of civil society easier in these countries especially when we still have countries where their civil society are not allowed to have any independent activity or being established at all. So here, many civil society organizations are providing lawyers for migrants in detention or facing detention and related matters. When allowing access to justice in a way and providing the space and time for that, government are helping and working with civil society in respect to the GCM and human rights. There should be effective, accessible, and safe access to justice channels and complaint mechanism through which workers can report violations and so on. Through this, we can see cooperation in a way and looking more in a way to solutions to the problem of detention and how to address detention and return, and involving civil society organizations in that. And also government needs to collaborate with civil society to spread knowledge. So what I mean here is help migrants understand laws, their rights and their duties. Translation, for example, interpretation services by civil society, coordinated and supported by governments, is one of the options here to make things clearer in a way for migrants and know what are their rights and what do they how can they address the problems they are facing. A space and a floor to address migrant-related issues and ensure providing support is essential here. There is a need to work on ensuring protection mechanism to identify vulnerable migrants. The government and civil society need to sit on the same table and discuss the situation and search and identify means to address it. Governments need to be cooperative and civil society needs to adopt positive criticism, because many of the cases we're looking at ways, what is the government doing wrong? But we are criticizing rather than providing solutions. So when seeing gaps, we are to address them and provide solutions. And civil society are to show that solutions are available, we have them, they are shaped to the country's context and are applicable. So it's also important here to address alternatives to detention and make sure that these alternatives are not worse than the detention itself and do not make the lives of migrants harder. So migrants have ran away from bad living conditions, not to fall in them again, but in a different unfamiliar place this time. And return needs here to be cooperated between the government. So civil society organizations are to again, be a middleman in the process and make sure that return does not end at the moment of return of the migrant to their country, because we need to focus on reintegration. We need to focus on adapting to the new lifestyle and so on. So there's many points in which civil society organization here, our role through advocacy, through the projects that we make, through the coordination with the governments, in which we can in a way shape a better future for the migrants, address detention in a positive manner, plus make return easier as long as it's not forced. So as long as it's vulnerable, make it easier for the migrants. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah. I would like to give the floor back to Ambassador Pardo and to Laila Razavi to make their final comment. But I want to acknowledge a comment on the chat by Kirsten Dimovitz, which I think it's very important. The problem is that her comment kind of would involve that we stay here perhaps for at least a couple of hours, but I think it's important to acknowledge it and to, to think that this is indeed how sadly we're moving now. What she's basically saying is that what we are seeing now is that many countries are moving into the practices of illegal pushbacks across the border, and that is basically what is happening in the European Union. And so what they are doing is that the challenge, she says, is that in the context of Europe is really to get into the European territory. But we have to look at, in terms of what's happening through pushbacks in Morocco, in Turkey, in Libya, in the Balkans, and more recently in Belarus. And she says that there may be a parallel there with precisely what we are seeing with the MPP policy that precisely Laila was commenting with what the US is doing, pushing individuals back to Mexico. But as I said, I think that that would invite us for a longer conversation. But I think I really appreciate your comment, Kirsten, and I think that that's an issue that I hope that we're able to discuss in a future meeting of this series, because I think it's extremely important. Ambassador Back, what your final comments and responses to some of the issues that were raised?
First, thank you very much for the invitation, because I obtained my aim, that was hearing you, and it was very, very, very useful for me, hearing from you and your comments. Very, very, very briefly, try to answer the Ngozi question that puts the accent on how difficult it is to manage migration in an open space as the European Union, where there is a liberty, the freedom of movement between the 27 member states. And so that's why I said I did not criticize any member state, because it's very complicated to manage, and even more collectively. The question Ngozi has said is perfect. I mean, it's one of the challenges. It is true. What do we do in an open space when this case of migrants that have been detained and after the 60 days, for instance, in Spain, go to another member state? Problems of trust among member state systems, because there are different systems as far as detention is concerned. But the same applies, for instance, in secondary movements on migratory of economic migrants, for instance. That's why for us is a problem. And to avoid that, this proposal of closed centers. So if you put the migrants in a closed center, it is safe and it is clear that there will be no longer secondary movements. Yes, but for us it's a problem, because legally, for us and for some other member states, I mean, mainly for the member states that we are in front line of the external borders of the European Union, because according to our own constitutions and our own legal system, it is not possible to detain people without having committed a crime. I mean, and with aims that are of deportation, for instance, that it can be some kind of justification, but in other cases, what is the justification? It is true that we save with that secondary movement, yes, but what is the price of paying for that? So, but it's the same challenge we have with asylum seekers, for instance, that well, applying in one country, they can go to another country, member state, I mean, of the European Union. So this is the challenges, the extra challenges that we have in an open space where freedom of movement is concerned, as is the European Union. It has negative effects, for instance, that these kind of things has led to 6 member states to reintroduce internal movements controls in the Schengen area that, you know, they are forbidden except for security reasons. No, but well, this is the by effects of this approach. So this comment, thank you very much again for the invitation, and thank you for all your opinions that they have been extremely interesting for us. Thank you.
Gracias, Embajador Pardo. Laila.
Well, to start to Ngosi's question, yes, in the United States, everybody wears a uniform in prison. It's typically like a head-to-toe jumpsuit that's one solid color. So it could be orange or blue. If you Google US prisons, I'm sure you'll see under Google Images different pictures of what these uniforms typically look like. So people in detention, you know, wear the same prison uniforms we see in all of our prisons and jails here. I see somebody raised a question in the chat about root causes that I don't know that we can do justice to in the next 8 minutes, but I will say, yes, I absolutely think, as others have mentioned already, US policy is, I don't think it's for me to speak on other countries, but I can say certainly that the United States has pursued various foreign policies and transnational agreements, economic agreements that have definitely over the years created instability in multiple forms, both through forms of government and through economic systems that have resulted in migratory patterns and people fleeing from their home country. So I think there's a lot to be discussed there. In the United States, our Vice President, Kamala Harris, came out early in the administration's time in office and made a comment about root causes. But really, she was using that phrase to make the case that we have to keep people in their home country and solve the problems there, which I think, as everyone who's here today can appreciate, for an individual facing immediate danger or instability is not really a good solution. And so I think it's just worth underscoring how challenging the problems that we're facing really are, because these phrases that we use in civil society, such as alternatives to detention or root causes, we talk about them for many years, we publish reports and studies, and eventually they make their way to the mouths of our lawmakers, and they're usually used to go back to the same solutions of expulsion and detention. I absolutely agree with the final question that we had received. I'm sorry, I forget the young woman's name, but yes, I think civil society has a huge role to play here in partnership with the United States. I think similar to what you described in the Middle East, we do have some programs here that serve immigrants in detention with things like services, providing them an orientation to their legal rights. This is a bare minimum in lieu of having legal representation. The federal government has contracts with specific nonprofit providers here in the United States who go into detention centers and hold classes and trainings and share resources with people to inform them what their rights are in various languages, and to explain to them what to expect when they get to court and appear in front of the immigration judge. So there is at least that. They still are facing off against a federal prosecutor who they have to argue against in front of the judge. And so without an attorney to make that case for them, this individual is left on their own to defend themselves. But yes, at the very least, there is that partnership between the United States government and nonprofits. And as we talked about earlier, there are a number of different methods that the government uses to contract with people, whether it's to contract with nonprofits, whether it's for minors or for providing some form of legal services. Those relationships exist. We have always envisioned that the solution to ending detention is through a partnership between the federal government and nonprofit providers. So to be very clear, while we think the arm of the federal government in the United States that is in charge of policing people and monitoring the US border is absolutely not fit, nor are the private prison companies. We do think we have social services agencies and refugee serving agencies in the United States that are used to dealing with people in a more humane fashion, and could serve as wonderful partners for civil society in establishing programs. And the model we envision would be contracts between those arms of the US government and nonprofit providers that provide optional, again, non-compulsory services for migrants who need to take use of them and choose to do so, to provide them with assistance as they resettle into the United States. And this could range from things such as healthcare and language access and securing housing, to a whole host of things, including access to legal services. So absolutely, I think the path forward for us has to involve a partnership between civil society and the government that really centers the autonomy and the rights of the individual.
Thank you, Laila. Thank you very much. I think that this has been a very lively and engaging conversation, both what's on the chat, as well as what the questions that we heard from the floor, and of course, the great intervention from the two panelists. We really appreciate your coming here today to share with us your work and your knowledge on this very difficult topic. Laila, thank you very much for waking up so early. You were absolutely lucid and brilliant. You may want to start considering working early in the mornings. I really think that these conversations are at least allowing us to start questioning a number of topics. First, to really dispute the narrative and the normalization of detention as part of the typical immigration processing. And that's the number one challenge. We do not need to deprive people of their freedom. And I think that that's what we are hoping that this series helps us start understanding. Differentiating what's happening when an individual is first coming into the country to when an individual is going to be expelled or deported from the country, I also think is also a very useful tool that we also have to unpack. And I really appreciate the conversation and the discussion on how we want to really come to solutions in the system. And I think that the work of organizations like Laila's, like Freedom for Immigrants, is very important in terms of trying to shed light on what's happening in detention centers, and also of inviting us to think of how we can create those partnerships. What are then the solutions? Because I think that that's also what we're hoping to do here, to try to identify where there are good policies that we can point out and say, this is a model that you can follow. And on the other side, also start thinking creatively, out of the box. What other alternatives, what other possibilities are there? Why are we forced to think one way and to accept and normalize inhumane treatment? That is what we were hoping to advance in our discussion today. Thank you for everyone. Thank you for all of the comments on the chat. I really think that this was a worthwhile discussion this morning. Thank you. Have a very good rest of the day or evening if you are in the other side of the world. Thank you.